Another type of ecosystem that can be extremely useful is a billboard ecosystem. This current scene is set up with procedural terrain and two different types of billboard objects. So this is a render, and basically what a billboard is just a flat plane where you use an image, color, and alpha. And what I've also done is set up some other color variations as well to make it look a little more varied. And it'll work just like any other type of ecosystem. So if we take a look at the ecosystem itself, two layers, or two objects in the ecosystem population, each being a different type of billboard. So if you're not familiar with billboards, go ahead and load up a new scene. And we go over to the object panel. The last object is an alpha plane billboard. So they're calling them alpha plane these days. I do believe in previous versions, when you hovered over it would say billboard, but even if not, we have the option to turn it on as a billboard and also keep it vertical. And I've just gone in and loaded in a color and an alpha picture of just a rendered tree. Now, in this case, what has happened is because the last object I had selected was the ground plane, it took the object material and the grass and mixed it together with these two image maps. So we have a blend of the two textures, and that is something you can do if you want that available, but I am going to reset the material and just load that in with a fresh material. I'm going to go ahead and drop this object. It's not going to allow me to. So I'll go ahead and reset the position to 0 for the X, Y, and Z. Go ahead and zoom in, pick this up, and I'm just going to go ahead and reload those images back in. And now I'm going to turn off the adjust plane proportions and then turn on billboard with the keep vertical option. Now what this will do is point at the camera no matter where the camera is facing. With the keep vertical option on, it'll always make sure it's pointing vertically. So it's a pretty neat solution. Especially if you have photographs of trees with alphas for them. So if you don't have a photograph or map set up, you can still use Vue to create these types of billboards the same way I have. And what you want to do is load in the tree you want to use, or even groups of trees. And I'm going to select the broadleaf straight trunk. And then what we can do is set up a render for this object. So that we're rendering just this object and nothing else. So let's just go ahead and set up a square render. We're going to set the aspect ratio to square. And I'm just going to set this up for a final render, render to screen. And if you're going to be seeing them from really far away, you could render out at 512 by 512. If you're planning on getting closer, then 1024 by 1024 might be more suitable, or even larger. So we just want to zoom in, and depending on the shot, where the camera placement is going to be, it's really going to determine how you need to set this up and where you need to render from, and whether or not you need to render from multiple angles. If we're going to be looking down mostly, then it's a good idea to tilt the camera down and just kind of look down onto the object a little. If you're really going to be going over them a lot more with the camera facing down, then you want to mimic that position, or at least kind of a medium in between. So now we're going to set up the lighting. We're going to go to the atmosphere editor, switch over first to the sun tab, and go ahead and take the pitch, and I'm going to set it to 88. Sometimes the brightness of the overall scene when it's set to 90 is a little too intense, so I'm just going to bump it down to 88 instead, and then go over to the environment mapping atmosphere model. If you go to the effects tab, we can invert the environment map, or you can just turn up the exposure all the way to 1. Either way, it will create the same sort of an effect. Sometimes using the exposure will work a little bit better because that's kind of built in to the lighting system. So either way. So now if we come over to the lighting tab, we can choose ambient occlusion or radiosity, really whatever you want to render with. I'm going to select, there's one other option back in the atmosphere editor, under effects, to map the ground plane, which is going to map it to this environment map color. And if we move over to the light tab, we do want to have more of an ambient light. We can also take our ambient light color and desaturate it, darken it up a bit. So you can shift between the sunlight and ambient light depending on the overall look, and if you want to have any sort of shadows showing up on it, at least to define the detail. If we go to the render options, you do want to make sure that hide infinite plane from alpha is turned on, because we can use the alpha output in order to clip out the object. Now there is one drawback to using this type of environment, and that is right now with it being white, the alpha map is going to clip out and basically show white behind it. And if we have texture filtering on, you don't really want to have a white background. So if you want, one thing you could do is render out a spherical render of the scene that the objects are going to be in, and set up saving that file as the environment map. But I want something that's going to be a little more open, be used in several scenes. So I'm going to switch over to the standard model, and what we can do is go to the sky tab and get rid of the fog in the sky, and then reset the color map, edit color map, and just load in. I'm going to load in one of my green presets that I have over here in the color selection, or you can just go ahead and set your own. You want it to be fairly close to the object itself that you're rendering. And it does look like I need to remove fog and haze. We don't want those to be part of this. And then we can adjust the overall sky color. We don't want it to be green. We just want that as our background. So now it's just kind of an adjustment between sunlight and ambient, and then we can adjust that sky color. I'm also going to take the sky dome lighting gain and set -0.1, just to darken it up a little bit more. So now we can render this out. And what you can do is save out the color and then the alpha from the render. And if you want to adjust the shadow options, you can go to the sunlight, maybe use a shadow map. I'm using a soft shadow map. If you need to define more areas so it's closer to a ray trace hard shadow, you can increase the ratio amount to something around 8 or 10, or you can choose the ray trace hard shadow and enable the softness option. 1 to 3 degrees should be okay. Actually, we'll go ahead and do 1 degree. And then we will bring it up a little more towards the sunlight option. And I'm going to go ahead and re-render that out. So I'm going to go ahead and save both of these files, the color and the alpha, as TIFF files. We can also use the Z depth to generate a more advanced bump. And the best way to do this is to save this out in the EXR format. So I'm just going to call this 3_Z because this is my third tree I'm working on for this. Now with the EXR format, you need to go to Options and turn off the Use Alpha because otherwise you're not going to get any useful information. Or at least when you're opening it in Photoshop, it doesn't really have anything you can use. So I'll go ahead and now we can close this out, and you can save this scene if you want to come back and use it again. Setting up either from different angles, different perspectives. You can change the focal length needed, or even set up, like I was saying before, groups of trees. So instead of just having one tree, you could set up a small little group of trees, and that will really help increase the realism if you have maybe 1 or 2 behind, 1 in front, and smaller variations. You can also just take care of that in an image manipulation program as well. Once you've created a bunch of different trees, just kind of blending them together. So I just have a new scene now with that alpha plane loaded in. I'm going to edit the object, turn on Billboard, and then click OK, and set up the material for it manually. Another thing I want to do is grab the pivot point. So in the Numerics tab, switch to the pivot, and just move the pivot down towards the bottom. And that should help the placement of the Billboard object as an ecosystem, so that it's closer to the trunk. You can go ahead and edit the material, reset the highlight color, or edit the color, and I'm going to bring it over to white. I did use a right-click reset, which will change the highlight color to black. Now we can edit the function, and instead of just directly using the texture map for the color, I do want to have a bit of variation. Now, I do also want to use the object parametric mode in the mapping mode, but this is going to limit the amount of color variation. So we are going to need an internal control linked to the world. So add input node, position options. And we're going to use world standard. So now I'm going to add in a color node and switch to the color brightness variation. Instead of using a straight color and just one solid color, we can use a texture map to control this. So I'm going to extract this and then add a texture map. And it does look like I added the wrong one. So we'll extract and add in texture map. And it looks like it is using a different setup here. We do have it on blended image. So I'm going to change this over just to the projected texture map. We can delete the extra nodes and now load in the color. And I'm going to turn off or leave off any interpolation types at the moment. The more we have turned on, the longer it could take for the render to complete. And if we don't need to have them on, if there's no issues with flickering, if you're rendering an animation or the look overall, then you shouldn't need to use interpolation types. So if we take a look at the color brightness variation, what we can do is adjust the roughness amount, which we don't want to go very high with. I'm going to increase noise variation. You can adjust the noise scale and just kind of tweak some of these values. If we want to increase the overall color variation, we just need to make sure we're not moving the sliders up too high, otherwise we're going to have some colors that are completely unwanted. So I'm going to turn down the saturation variation a little, and that's basically our color setup. We do want to connect this color brightness node to the position options for the world, and that way the blend is going to be global. I'm also going to turn off the tiling modes for the projected texture map, and add in another texture map, and we can load in the alpha. Now I'm going to connect this to the transparency output as a grayscale output from the projected texture map and invert. And then over in the transparency tab, just make sure that variable transparency is turned on. This should be set up automatically once you connect to that output, and global transparency is set to 100%. So that's kind of the initial setup. I'm also going to make sure that the alpha is going to show correctly and set up a constant number of -1. Connect that to the alpha. So here is the way the billboard looks, with just a preview render. I do want to make some further modifications. Basically, we don't have a backlight set, and I do want a minimal amount of backlight used in order for the light to shine correctly through the leaves of the tree. So I just have the color map loaded into Photoshop, and what I want to do is use image adjustment replace color, selecting the tree trunk, reducing the fuzziness amount, and then reducing the lightness. And what we can do then is darken all of the branches. Then we can then Control L for levels, and just kind of fine-tune that. And that should work pretty well for the backlight. We can always blend it together with a darker color if we need to subtract if this is way too bright. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out as a backlight. And I've just loaded in the Z-depth EXR. And what I'm going to do is limit, so Control L for the levels, and just kind of reduce the output amount. Now we don't need anything behind the tree. And a lot of what we're seeing within the histogram is really just the gradient of the ground plane. And then there's that separation where you can see a very clear spike, and that's basically where our tree is standing out. So we just want to reduce the output to that range. Click OK. And now we can move this over to 16-bit, and then reduce again. And then you could choose to stay with the 16-bit or move over to 8-bit. Since we're controlling bump, it might be best to leave it in 16-bit. One thing we need to do is invert. So Control I will allow us to invert this. And I don't want these very large drop-offs. Really just want to use the EXR or the Z-depth to give a basic shape. So I'm going to move over to the surface blur, and we can just kind of blur out some of the edges. Now first I might want to actually go to Noise, Reduce Noise, setting the Preserve Details to 2, and just kind of smoothing it out a bit. And then we can blur with the surface blur. So really, depending on how much depth you want out of this, you can adjust the overall radius and threshold. And then we can go back into levels and just balance this out a little better. Okay, so now we can save this out, first converting over to the grayscale. So image mode grayscale, and then save that out as our bump. So now back in Vue, going into the function, we can add in a couple more texture maps. And we have the bump and the backlight. Now, typically when you're using a bump controlled by an image, you will want to turn on an interpolation type. That's one setting that typically you would really want to have an interpolation type on. You can try it without. Pretty much you're going to get the best result whenever that's on. So now we also need to set up the backlight. So we can add an output color backlight and connect that to the color output. So the render of this tree looks a little ridiculous right now. So what we want to do is limit the bump intensity and change the depth to 0.1. Most image-controlled bumps you really want to reduce to a lower amount and a lower value. 1 is typically way too much because with procedurals, having 1 works normally just fine, but with the limited range of an image, you certainly don't want to have a full bump. So let's go ahead and move behind the sun and take a look and see how the backlight is turning out. Looks like it might be a little bit dark, but it's not completely black. And this kind of tree I think I'm going to have darker anyway. You can also choose to use just a solid color, but then it's going to shine through the trunk, which is why I like to use an image for this. Now another thing you can do is add a little bit of variation to the shader and the smoothing angle and the contrast. So what I want to do for this is connect the contrast, extracting it, connect it to a noise node. And we'll go ahead and just change this over to gradient, set our scale to 7. Also make sure we're connecting this to our position options world coordinate. And I want to set up a map filter and change the upper value to 0.8 and the lower value to 0.1. And clip the outer range values. And that way we'll have a little bit of variation throughout the shader. So it's already starting to look pretty good. I'm going to go back to the pivot and adjust it to line up with the bottom of the trunk. So pivot position, and if you want you can switch over to a different viewport, frame the view, and that way you can line it up a little bit better. We'll take a look in the front view and just adjust the X position and move that inside the trunk. So now, once this is set up, what we can do is right-click and save the object. And I'm going to incorporate the texture maps. Click OK and save that out. So now we can load that in as an ecosystem. And I'm going to load in the other scene and just add that new billboard to the current ecosystem. So we can add a little more variation. So add in an object, and I'm just going to load this from file because I don't have this as part of my library. And I'll go ahead and repopulate, and we'll be able to see those new trees showing. The transparency may not render correctly. It does look like only one of my objects isn't rendering the transparency correctly, and I am using the billboard mode because at the moment the shaded billboard mode just isn't working. We could pretty easily switch this over to smooth shaded mode as well, because they are just planes, one polygon each. The biggest thing to worry about is the textures themselves. which might slow things down. So just billboard mode will work alright. So now you can see the new billboard showing, which are the lighter green trees. And I will have to do a little bit of matching between the materials to kind of adjust the shading. But I want to make a few notes. There are things you need to keep in mind when using billboards, part of an ecosystem. Basically, the rotation, up and down only, does not apply because this billboard is set to always face the camera. Now, you don't have to set it to face the camera. You can just set it to vertical only if you wanted. The only problem then is you're going to end up with a lot of sliced objects where all you can see is just a thin line, which might not work out very well. The direction from surface you can adjust, but it's kind of problematic in some cases. So that one really sometimes just kind of iffy. Other than that, it works pretty much the same way. So really it's just the rotation you have to worry about. Now I did have to, under the density, change the proportion and size of instance offset. So offset from surface, proportion and size of instance, and lowered it about 7%. That way they're going below the ground plane properly, or the in this case the terrain, and without that on they were actually raised up a little bit. And here is another render. Now the biggest difference between the objects, the current ones I had and the new one, is the way the backlight works. So if we want to change this material, we can go over to the Material tab and select the one I didn't name, which is just called Material. We can edit this and now directly modify the instance material. So we're going to go to the backlight and select the link, add in a blender, and then add in a constant color of RGB value of 0, which is going to be black. And then we can just blend that so that we just have a little bit of light showing through, not a lot. And we're blending it with black because we do want that as the minimum. If we were to use a lighter color, it would start to lighten the trunks of the trees, which is defeats the whole purpose of using an image map for the backlight. So that is a little more balanced now. Another big difference is the type of bump map being used between the objects. I didn't use the z-depth to render the other objects for the bump. What I ended up doing was just kind of creating a gradient map, or a combination of a couple of gradient maps within Photoshop. And one of these objects doesn't have that bump setup. But this is the image map. It's a 16-bit grayscale, which is kind of a circular gradient towards the top, and then a mirrored gradient through the center out to the sides, along with a little bit of reduction by the trunk. And that way it adds a bit of curvature to the overall look of the plane. And by using different options, it really adds a lot more variation to the ecosystem. So this can be used for a lot of different areas of Vue. Fast motion shots, or more static camera positions, at least orientation-wise. And then previs or object replacement. There's a lot of different options for this. Also, more distant trees, any sort of digital matte painting, because these objects can also be used for the ecosystem painter, which is pretty nice. So you could paint in billboards as needed. They're very lightweight. Right now in the scene, it shows 604,000 polygons. Basically, every single alpha is just one polygon. So we only have a little over 19,000 instances, so 19,000 of these objects. So that's only 19,000 polygons. The rest are the procedural terrain. So using this in combination with the standard terrain, we'd have a very, very lightweight scene that would render very quickly and reduce a lot of the issues that can happen when you have a lot of geometry. And besides the lack of shape variation, this really works out pretty well. So if I was to move on with this and really want to create more variations, I would just create more billboards, rendering out additional objects. And that way we can really create a lot more variation within the scene. But setting up more varied scaling can also really help. So setting the maximum size variation a little higher, reducing the overall scaling to compensate, then you can get a lot smaller trees in there. And a nice little mix. So here we go with some smaller variations. Overall, I think it looks pretty good. It's definitely a very nice and lightweight solution. Probably add 4 or 5 more variations and have a pretty complete scene.